Hey, how's it going? Good morning, Laracon 2016. Is everybody excited to be here or what? Are you guys ready to look at a lot of code this morning? I don't really do slides, so I got a couple here, but that's mostly going to be code. So this talk is called Test-Driven Laravel. We're going to spend kind of an hour and a half talking about my approach to test-driven development in Laravel and kind of show you how to go from a brand new application that has absolutely nothing done to it, not a single line of code written, no configuration specified or anything, and drive out some features completely test first without writing a single line of code first. So for the slide portion, I want to talk about test-driven development in general a little bit and kind of give a bit of an introduction to the idea of it for anyone who's not super familiar. So at the core of it, test-driven development is about this workflow, this TDD loop, where you start by writing a failing test, then you do whatever you need to do to make that failing test pass, and then once you have that failing test passing, you can refactor your code until you're kind of happy with the design and happy with how it looks, all while trying to keep the tests green and keep everything passing the whole time. And then when that's done, you move on to writing your next failing test and working on the next feature. So kind of a classic example is something like this, where maybe you're trying to build like a little calculator class, and you're trying to use test-driven development to kind of unit test this calculator. So here we have a test that's checking that you can add two numbers with this calculator, right? So we new up a calculator. We call this add method. We pass it two parameters, 5 and 7. And then we assert that those added up to 12. So the first thing that you need to do here is run the tests and see what the error that you get is. So we get an error something like this, class calculator not found. Because we're doing TDD, we haven't written any code yet, so there's no way that the calculator class can exist. So following the errors, the first thing that you would do is define the calculator class. And that's all you have to do. Then you run the tests again. And now we get an error saying that there's no add method because our class was empty. So we go and add an add method. We specify the parameters that we kind of had outlined in our test. And we run the test again. And now we get another error saying that we expected 12 but got null because we're not returning anything from that function. So now you go and actually write an implementation for your add method, run the test again, and finally everything is green. So this is kind of like the classic way that I see test-driven development introduced to people, kind of at the unit level, where you're driving out these like small isolated components that have no dependencies that do really simple stuff. And when you're trying to learn test-driven development this way, it sounds really easy. Like it sounds like, oh yeah, that sounds like a cool way to do things. I think I can do that. But then in my experience, when you go to build like an actual application and you try and put this stuff into practice, all of a sudden it seems a lot harder because you have things that are like making network requests to GitHub or like generating PDFs or hitting the database, all sorts of stuff that you can't just do in like a little isolated class with no dependencies. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the workflow that I use to kind of like get the ball rolling with TDD in an actual application instead of just like driving at these little isolated units that to me are not really representative of what it's like to build this stuff out in the real world. So we're going to be building an app called Tweeter. It's probably similar to an app that you might have heard of. It's a little bit better though because the tweets go to 141 characters. It's like the Spinal Tap of Twitter. So what are some of the, we got to figure out what is the very first test that we need to write for this application. This is kind of like the classic point where someone gets stuck. If they're trying to like do TDD for an application, you kind of want to do it right from the very beginning. You don't want to like write some code and try and decide like, okay, well, how much code am I allowed to write before I start writing tests? Can I at least define a route? Can I configure my database? Stuff like that. And my opinion is no. If you want to do test-driven development properly, write a test first and kind of let that drive everything out, and we're going to talk about how to do that. So when you're trying to figure out what your very first test should be, you have to think about like, what are the features that this application is going to have? So what are a couple things that you might be able to do in Tweeter? Well, create an account. That's something that you're probably going to have to do. Post a tweet. View someone else's tweets, like go to someone's profile page and see what they've been talking about. Follow another user so their tweets show up in your timeline. Or view your timeline and kind of see the tweets that all your followers, or the tweets that the people you are following have been tweeting. So how do we go about deciding which one of these to start with when we're working on a brand new application? Well, there's a book called Growing Object-Oriented Software, Guided by Tests, written by Nat Price and Steve Freeman. And when they're faced with this problem, trying to figure out what the very first test should be in an application that they're working on, they talk about this idea of trying to string up what they call a walking skeleton. And a walking skeleton is basically like trying to do as little as possible to kind of string the whole app up so that you have everything that's kind of needs to be set up for like requests to work kind of in place so that you can kind of like hit an endpoint, have it cut through the app as much as possible, and come back to the user. Something that kind of proves that things are in place and you have a structure to kind of be working with. So keeping this idea of a walking skeleton in mind, let's look at the features that we talked about and kind of evaluate each one of them against our goal here and see which one makes the most sense to start with. So creating an account. Creating an account, what's it going to involve? It's going to involve some sort of UI. So we're going to have maybe like a sign-up endpoint and a form that someone fills out and submits, and that's going to create a user account and store it in the database, and then maybe let them know that they were registered successfully, something like that. So that does sound like it's going to like cut through the whole app in terms of right from the UI to the back end and all the way back to the user. So if that process works, then we've kind of verified that we've got something up in place. But in my opinion, it's kind of like sidestepping the whole point of the application, which is like Tweeter is about tweets and being able to view someone's tweets and post tweets. Creating an account is something that you do in every single application, well, a lot of applications. And I would rather start with something that like is more focused on what the app is actually about, if possible. So I'd prefer to cross this one off for now and see if there's something else that fits our criteria a little bit better. So posting a tweet. So posting a tweet again, there's going to be some sort of endpoint, some UI, a form, you're going to fill it out, and it's going to store something in the database and kick stuff back. And it's about the app. Like posting a tweet is kind of a core thing. So it sounds like a pretty reasonable candidate. But is there any kind of complexity that's going to get in the way in terms of slowing us down and adding time to how long it's going to take for us to get this walking skeleton up in place? And I think the little bit of complexity I see there is that it kind of depends on people having accounts and being registered, right? You don't want people to just be able to post tweets without having an account. So to be able to post a tweet, we need to worry about authentication and having users created and stuff. And it'd be nice to avoid that if possible. So let's cross that one off for now and talk about some other stuff. So viewing someone else's tweets. So again, this is going to kind of cut through the whole app. There's going to be some endpoint that you have to hit. You're going to be pulling some data from the database and kind of displaying it on the screen. But the nice thing about it is that you don't need to be authenticated to do this. So it kind of lets us avoid the whole authentication aspect and still get to some stuff that's related to the core of the app, which is tweets in this case. So I'd like to start with this idea of being able to view someone else's tweets. I think that's a reasonable place to start. There's probably plenty of other places to start, but it seems as good as any in my opinion. So that TDD loop we talked about before, where you just are writing a failing test, trying to make it pass, then refactoring and working on to the next failing test. I find when you're trying to build an actual application, you have to worry about testing the user interface and stuff like that. Things are a little bit more complicated than that. And I use an approach called outside-in test-driven development or acceptance test-driven development that looks a little bit more like this. So the first step is to write a failing acceptance test, something kind of from the end user's point of view that kind of defines the outside-in sort of black box behavior of the system. Then you work on making that test pass, which often involves driving out unit tests for smaller components and making those pass with this kind of inner TDD loop. And once all that stuff is working, hopefully your acceptance test is now passing, and you can do any kind of high-level refactoring you want and then move on to the next acceptance test. So this is kind of the workflow that I like to use and that I would like to go over today. So enough with slides. Let's write some code. So I've got a brand new Laravel application here that doesn't have anything edited at all, just kind of Laravel new with the dependencies installed and stuff, so we don't have to worry about depending on the network or anything. And I want to walk through how we can implement this feature of viewing another user's tweets. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're not going to configure our database, we're not going to create any routes, anything like that. We're going to write a test. So what should this test be called, and where should we put this test? Sidebar is a little bit small here, but I'll kind of talk about how I'm organizing this stuff. What I like to do when I'm writing a new acceptance test, the way I like to keep my tests organized these days, is kind of simple. I kind of have like a features folder in my tests folder and a unit folder. And the features folder is where I'm kind of doing these acceptance tests, and the unit folder is where I'm doing tests for individual components. I've seen people do a lot more complicated setups than that. In my experience, this kind of simple differentiation between the two has worked out pretty well, and it's something I've been using for quite a while now and been pretty happy with it. So the first thing that I would want to do is create a new test in a new folder called features in our tests folder. So let's just start with this example test that Laravel provides out of the box. And we'll just move this to features / and now we'll rename the test to something like view another user's tweets test. So we have this file now. Let's rename the actual test. So we'll call it view another user's tweets test. And we'll kind of delete this stuff because we don't need it, and we don't need this comment. And let's kind of figure out what we need to do. So the test itself is going to be like test can view another user's tweets. Now let's think about what we kind of need in place for this to work, right? So to be able to view another user's tweets, we're going to need to have a user that has tweets, right? So we're going to have some sort of user in the system. That user is going to need to have tweets. And then to be able to view that user's tweets, we're going to need to like go to their profile page, right? So maybe visit that user's profile. And then we want to see their tweets. So this is kind of like the outline of what we want to be able to do here in this test. So let's kind of walk through filling in these comments one at a time with some real code and see where it takes us. So having a user in this system, how can we have a user in the system kind of ready for us to work with? Well, there's a couple ways that we could do it. First way that you might think of, especially since we're doing this kind of acceptance test-driven development, this outside-in thing, is you might think, okay, well, maybe we need to go to the registration page and register that user, and then go to the tweets page and post a tweet as that user, and then log out so that we're a guest in the system, and then go to that person's page and view their tweets. That's certainly one way to do it. I think it's not the best way to do it in this case because it's going to get in the way of our kind of walking skeleton. And it's also testing a lot of things that are not really related to this test. So if there's a way that we can kind of avoid all that stuff and do it a little bit more directly, I think that will help us out. So what I like to do in these sorts of cases is use an approach that is referred to in the RSpec book, which is like a book on using RSpec and behavior-driven development in Ruby and Rails applications. And they call this approach direct model access, where you're creating models that you need in your test directly, even in acceptance tests, to kind of set up the world that you want in a kind of a fast and direct way, and then kind of act around that data and make assertions about it. So how can we create a user? So we can do something like user equals, and now Laravel, as of I think 5.0 or 5.1 maybe, it ships with a feature called model factories, which are some testing helpers that let you kind of generate eloquent models really quickly in your tests, and let you avoid kind of a lot of duplication and stuff, and kind of only specify the stuff that's important for what you're trying to do. So it looks kind of like this to do. So we're going to do something like factory, user, class, and we're going to create that user. And in theory, that should give us a user. And now the next thing that we need is tweets for this user, right? Well, I think multiple tweets maybe is going to slow us down a little bit. Why don't, for now, we just worry about a single tweet? And that'll kind of help us get this walking skeleton in place. So instead of tweets, let's just create a tweet. So what does it look like to create a tweet? Well, it's going to look kind of similar. Now, I'm going to reference a class here that we haven't defined yet. And the reason I do that is because I'm using this approach that's also referred to in the Growing Object-Oriented Software book as programming by wishful thinking, where everyone always laughs at that, but I think it's kind of a cool idea. Basically, the idea is that you're writing code that you wish existed or expect to exist or hope existed, and you let the tests tell you whether it does exist or doesn't exist. You just kind of write the code that you wish you had and run the tests, and if the tests say, oh, dude, you haven't defined that yet, then you go ahead and define it. But a lot of the time, the stuff does exist. Like, for example, this user class, Laravel ships with one out of the box. But this tweet class, it doesn't. So we'll create a tweet, and we need this tweet to belong to this user, right? So what you could do is you could do something like this, create, and then here you could specify, how do we want to set this up? Well, I think a tweet should belong to a user if it has a user ID that matches the user's ID. And then maybe we need like some sort of content for this tweet, right? So maybe we have like a body on the tweet that's something like my first tweet. Now this will work, but I don't really like the idea of referencing like foreign keys and kind of leaking this information about like what the column names and stuff are that manage those relationships kind of all over the application. I think there's a simpler way to do it. And what we can do instead is we can use make instead of create. So create is creating a user and storing it in the database. Make is just creating a tweet in memory that's almost ready to be persisted but isn't persisted yet. And then we can save that tweet by calling user tweets save tweet. And again, none of this code exists yet, right? We're doing this programming by wishful thinking thing, just kind of writing the code we wish we had, and we're going to let the tests kind of tell us when we have something that we actually need to implement. So visit the user's profile. So we can do that by going this, visit, and then just decide what we want the endpoint to be. In this case, I think we'll just put it at like the person's username directly hanging off the root of the app, kind of like Twitter does. So we're going to need this person to have a username, right? So let's specify that their username is maybe John Doe. And then we'll visit John Doe. And now we want to be able to see their tweets, or in this case, see their one tweet. And we can do that just by calling see my first tweet. So this is kind of our first, simplest, most basic test. And now we just need to run this and watch for errors and try and get it passing. And again, remember, we're starting from like a very fresh, nothing in it Laravel application. So we're going to run into a lot of stuff that's just kind of basic setup stuff. But it's interesting, in my opinion, to kind of see how you can use the tests to force you to create migrations, to force you to define routes, stuff like that. So we'll run this test. We get an error, unable to locate factory with the name user. And in that case, this is because the user class is namespace and we haven't imported it. So we'll import the user class, run the test again. Now we get an error, access denied for user homestead at localhost, because it's trying to create a user in like the database that Laravel ships with out of the box, like in its environment configuration, which is the homestead stuff. We don't really want a real database like set up in homestead or anything for this. So we can use this information to kind of help us drive out our database configurations. How can we fix that error? Well, I like to use an in-memory database whenever possible, like a SQLite in-memory database for tests. Sometimes you outgrow it, but I think as a starting point, it's a reasonable thing to try. And the way that we can do that is by adding a few environment variables to our PHP unit configuration. So down at the bottom here, we can say DB connection should be SQLite. And then our DB database, which is usually the file name where you want this SQLite file stored. If you use colon, memory colon, it's just going to create one in memory at the beginning of every test that's not actually saved anywhere, just kind of discard it at the end. So if we run these tests again, we get an error, no such table users. Okay, so that means we have to migrate our database, right? So the easiest way to do that in Laravel is to just use this database migrations trait. So if we type use database migrations, run the test again, now we get an error, table users has no column named username. So Laravel does give us a user table migration out of the box with some stuff defined. And we need to kind of tweak this to kind of meet our needs here. So I'm just going to kind of delete the email. I'm going to leave password, remember token, and timestamps because Laravel's kind of configured to expect some of that stuff, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds there, so just kind of delete what we can. But let's change this this name column to be username so that we can kind of get past this error of missing the name column. So table users has no column named name. That's interesting. So why does it have no column named name? If we go and look at our model factory, which is where the default user factory is defined by Laravel, you can see it's still trying to fill in stuff that we're no longer using. So let's use username instead of name, and we can use Faker's username generator, get rid of the email. Again, we'll leave the password and remember token just to avoid getting too deep in the weeds. And run our tests again. And now we get an error, unable to locate factory with the name tweet. So this is actually significant progress because we finally made it past this first line, which means we have a user created and that user is in the database. So if we were to go here and just like dump that user out and run the tests, you can see we actually have a user in the system now, which is pretty cool. And we did all of that through TDD. We never made any changes without the tests kind of telling us what change to make. So we have no factory for tweets. So let's create a tweet factory. So we'll duplicate this factory for now, and we'll point it at app tweet class. And we just won't have anything in there because we want to kind of let the test kind of guide us here. If we run the test again, we get an error, unable to locate factory with the name tweet again. And the reason for that now is that we haven't imported this tweet namespace. So we'll just duplicate this line here because we're expecting that this tweet should be in the app namespace. Run the tests. Now we get an error that there's no tweet class. Okay, so following the errors, let's generate a tweet class. So we can go artisan, make, model, tweet. And now we have a tweet eloquent model kind of scaffolded out for us. Run the tests again. Call the undefined method tweets on the query builder. So what's happening here is we're trying to call tweets here to save this tweet on the user, and it's noticing that there's no tweets method defined on the user, so it's kind of checking a couple kind of just in case locations, and the query builder is kind of where it ends up at the end of the day. So what this is telling us is that we need to define a tweets method on the user. So let's go to our user class, and down here we'll just add a method called tweets. And this is just gonna, we'll just leave it empty for now, run the tests again. Call to a member function save on null. So it's trying to call save on the result of tweets, which is nothing in this case. So let's set up our relationship. So this has many tweet class. Run the test again. No such table tweets. Okay, making progress. Now we need a migration for our tweets. So artisan make migration, creates tweets table, create equals tweets. Oh, this is an error that me and Taylor ran into yesterday. If we just dump composer and run it again, we should be good. Okay, so we have our tweets table migration. Run the tests again. Tweets has no column named body. Okay, so let's go to our create tweets table migration, and we'll add a body. So table string, body. Run the tests again. No column user ID. So it's pretty cool, right? These tests are really kind of telling us every single mistake that we're making, and all we're doing is kind of responding to the errors that the terminal is kind of driving out for us. So if we head back to our migration again, we can add that foreign key. So to keep things simple, we'll just add a user ID, make it unsigned, run the tests again. And now we get some sort of more interesting error. So a request to localhost / John Doe failed that received a 404. So what this is telling us is that we haven't defined a route. So now we can head to our routes file and define the very first route for our application. So if we go to routes web, I'm using Laravel 5.3 here, so a couple changes here. So now your routes file by default is in routes/web.php instead of routes.php. We can define a endpoint. So this is going to be a GET request to someone's username. And now we could try and do all this work in this closure, but to me that doesn't really help us get to the design that we inevitably want to land on. Oh. I will make sure not to touch that cable for the rest of the presentation. So what I like to do is kind of use that programming by wishful thinking kind of approach again, where we'll kind of write code that we wish we had and let the tests kind of tell us when it does or doesn't exist and kind of fill in the gaps as we go. So where would I like this to kind of go? How would I like this to work? I think ideally I would like this to be something like the show method on the user's controller. So if we run the test again, now we get an error that there is no user's controller. So we can run artisan, make controller, user's controller, run the tests again. Some messy error here. Received a 500 because the user's controller has no show method. Okay, thanks tests, let's create a show method. So we head over to our user's controller that's newly generated and define the show method. We'll just leave it empty and run the tests again. And now we get an error that the current node list is empty. And what this means is that in this test where we're doing this kind of C assertion, it's trying to inspect the HTML that came back and find the text that we're looking for. So the way it works is it kind of crawls through all the HTML DOM nodes and looks for the text. And in this case, we aren't returning any HTML, so it can't find anything to check against. So again, programming by wishful thinking, how would I like this to work? Well, I would just like to return the users.show view. Run the tests again. Now we get an error that there is no users.show view. Okay, let's create a users.show view. So if we head to our resources views folder, we'll create a new folder called users. And in there, we'll create a show.blade.php. And we'll just run the tests again. We get back to that error of the current node list being empty. So why is it empty now? Well, it's empty because the Blade view is empty. So programming by wishful thinking, let's kind of just write the code that we wish we had and let the test kind of guide us. So maybe we want to do just like for our basic implementation, it's like an unordered list where we loop over the tweets. And we stick each one in like an li, and we just do like the body of the tweet in there. Right? Go and run the tests again, and now I'm expecting an error about that variable not being defined in the view, right? But we'll let the tests kind of tell us that. So, scrolling up to this big nasty error, we get undefined variable tweets, just like we kind of expected. So that means we need to pass in a tweets variable. So let's just say that the tweets should be our tweets variable in the controller, which also is yet to be defined, but we'll let the tests kind of let us know about that. So we get the same similar error here, but now the undefined tweets variable is in the controller. Okay, so heading to the controller, now we have to think like, how are we going to get these tweets? So what you could do is you could say something like, tweets equals user tweets, and run the tests again and see what happens. Well, it's going to say something about that user being undefined, right? Okay, so how do we get the user? So now we have to do things that are a little bit more interesting. So to find that user, we could do something like this. We could say like user equals user where username is username, and make sure that we take that as a parameter to the route, and then get the first one, and then get their tweets, and then we'd be kind of good to go, right? But again, this is a situation where, to me, this isn't helping me get to the design that I think I would like to land on, where I don't really want to just chain a bunch of where clauses and stuff in my controllers. Ideally, I'd like to come up with some more expressive methods that kind of express what I'm actually trying to do. So what I might do instead is something like this. User find by username, pass in the username, and run the tests again. And now we're going to get an error. The user's not found. Okay, so we got to import the user class in our controller. So import app user, run the tests. And now I'm expecting an error, something about not having that method defined. So we have no find by username method. So we could kind of just let the acceptance test here work as an umbrella that covers this and let us drive out this functionality. Or we could use this as an opportunity to jump down to the unit level and write out a unit test for this function, which I think is a good way to go. So let's create a new folder in our tests folder called unit. And then in this unit folder, we'll create a user test.php. And I'm just going to copy this test in to get some of the boilerplate in place for us. So we'll just call this user test. Let's kind of get rid of the stuff that we don't really need yet and figure out what we want to call this test. So something like test can find users by their username. So what is this test going to look like? Well, we're going to need a user in the system to look for, right? So we can do that kind of the same way we did before. So we can say user equals factory user class, create, and we're going to want to specify their username so that we can find them. So maybe we'll look for Jane Doe this time. And then we want to look up the user by their username and kind of verify that we got the right one. So let's call this created user, and we'll say found user equals user find by username Jane Doe. And then we want to just make some assertions to make sure that they are in fact the same user. So maybe we want to verify that their IDs are the same. So we could do something like assert that the created user ID is the same as the found user ID. And maybe we'll just verify that the username is what we expected as well. So we'll make sure that the found user's username is Jane Doe. Run this test, and we'll just kind of let TDD guide us through the process here. No such table users. OK, so we got to use our database migrations like we did for the other test. Call the undefined method find by username. So now we have an opportunity to actually drive this method out. So if we head over to our user class, and maybe right here we can add a new static method called find by username that takes the username as a parameter. We'll run the test again. Trying to get property of non-object. So what this is complaining about is that find by username is not actually returning a user yet. So let's drive that out. We can use that implementation that we had kind of talked about directly in the controller, right? Something like return self where username is the username, and maybe just get the first one. And if we run this test, we're green. Now if we head back to our acceptance test and run it, it's also green. So that was kind of an example of doing that outer TDD loop that forced us to drive into that inner unit testing TDD loop, drive out a unit test for this user class, and ultimately get both the unit tests and the acceptance test passing. So now we've kind of implemented that first feature that kind of gets our walking skeleton in place without ever having to open the browser, without ever having to just kind of blindly write code. Everything was done test first, which I think is a pretty cool way to do things. So I have another whole feature that I want to drive out, but I think maybe it would be good to take a break for a minute or two and just see if anyone has any questions about kind of what we just walked through there. So if anybody has any questions, kind of make yourself known. I think there's some mics somewhere. You might even be able to just walk up to the mic if anybody has a question. Hi. Yeah, sure. Any particular piece that you're interested in? Cool. So it's just these two lines here. So what we're doing is we're specifying that for the DB connection, we want to use SQLite. And if you check out config database.php, that's just specifying which connection should be used as the default connection. So that's going to look up this driver here, our SQLite connection story. And then that connection is looking for an environment variable called db database to specify what database to use, or defaults to kind of database.sqlite. And we're setting that environment variable to :memory:, which tells SQLite to run it in memory. Does that help? Cool. Any other questions, or? Yep.
I'm just curious, in this step-by-step here, there's a lot of steps I would just skip because I know I'm going to expect that next error.
Totally.
How critical is it that you run the test every single small change? Is that part of the core of this approach?
I would say it's a good idea to run the tests frequently after every small change while you're learning and kind of getting comfortable with it. Because you don't want to make the mistake of writing code that the tests wouldn't have forced you to write, which is, I think, a common mistake that people make. So, for example, one thing that we could have done that I explicitly avoided was when we did the create tweets table migration. We know that we want the tweets to only be 141 characters, right? But I didn't set a constraint on the database because there's no test telling us to do that yet. But a lot of people might have done that. So when you're just trying to figure it out and get comfortable with the workflow, I think it's a good idea to run them really often and kind of get used to the sorts of errors that you're getting. Once you get comfortable with it and you kind of can predict what the errors are going to be all the time, and you get comfortable with making sure that you're not writing code that you shouldn't be writing yet, you can totally skip running the tests as often as I am here and kind of writing more code at a time. And when I'm actually doing this, I'm not running the tests quite as often as I am here. But I do like to just kind of walk through it to kind of demonstrate how useful the feedback can be and kind of how you can use that to drive out the implementation. Any other questions, or do you want to dive into the next thing? Sure.
Self-explanatory, like the node is empty and stuff like that. Are you just figuring out what that actually means through experience, or are you looking in various places to figure out what that error is telling you?
Sure. So the question was, when you get errors from these acceptance tests that are not super clear, like the node list is empty, and it doesn't tell you like what line caused that, where in your stack trace the problem is or whatever. How do you kind of trace those down and figure out what the actual root cause of the problem is? A lot of it does just come down to having seen them before and trying to like figure it out when you run into them. So to me, the biggest benefit of like the unit testing portion, like that inner TDD loop, is helping you get more useful feedback for a lot of things. It doesn't help in that specific case with like the node crawler stuff, but a lot of the time if you find yourself in a situation where it's like, my tests are not giving me like useful information about failures anymore, they're just kind of like blowing up and I don't know why, a lot of the time that can be a sign that you should jump down to the unit test level and try and drive something out a little bit closer to the metal so that you get more useful feedback. In the DOM crawler sort of case, it's a little bit more based on just kind of experience and kind of just hacking through the weeds to figure it out. But yeah, I think it's a useful thing to talk about, this whole idea of using the unit tests to find the more useful errors a lot of the time too. Okay, I'm going to dive into the next one because it's actually a longer example than this first one, and I don't want to run out of time. An hour and a half actually is not that long to build a bunch of features in an application. But yeah, so we'll just go and see what happens. So let's kind of throw away everything that we just did. And I'm going to check out a branch that's time traveling to the future a little bit. So we're a few weeks into building this application. And now we have this app called Tweeter, and we've got a user interface, and you can post tweets like something about, man, Laracon is so awesome this year, right? Oh. I didn't test that part. Anyways, don't worry about it. It's all good. So more importantly, related to the stuff that we're actually going to go and work on here, is you can like see how many people are following you or who you're following. I can unfollow people. I can like follow new people, whatever. And we want to add this bit of functionality where anytime like you get a new follower, anytime someone follows someone, we want to send the person who was followed a notification email saying, hey, you have a new follower, sort of thing. So let's drive that out with TDD now that we're kind of like a little deeper into the application and we're not just kind of doing getting stuff scaffolded out, and kind of talk about a couple more interesting bits of interactions that you might need to do in your tests. So I have a test in place already for following another user. So we have this follow other users test, which is basically what happens when we go and click that follow button, right? So we create a follower, we create a followed. Acting as the follower, we make a request to the following endpoint storing this username, and then we just assert that we got redirected back to our following page showing us the list of people we're following, and we assert that the follower now follows the followed. So let's write a test for making sure that we can send this notification email. So the way that I would do this is, since it's kind of like a whole other part of this feature, I would actually duplicate this test to start with, even though the setup is going to be very similar, and just kind of make these assertions kind of their own thing, so we can give this test a better name. So instead of just having a test called test a user can follow another user that happens to have all these details about like mail and stuff like that, I'd rather give it a separate name, something like test users are sent a notification email when they are followed. Test names can be very long a lot of the time, but it's better for them to be descriptive than it is to try and aim for short test names. So what is this going to look like? Well, we're going to kind of do the same thing. We'll like set up a follower and a followed. Let's sketch this out a little bit more. So who could the follower be? Let's think. Maybe DHH? Yeah, DHH. And who will the followed be? Naturally, Adam Wathen. My life's mission. So acting as DHH, we will try and follow me on Tweeter, the hottest new social network. And now we got to make some assertions. So kind of jumping out of the TDD workflow for a minute, I want to kind of show you what it might look like if you implemented this code first and then tried to write the tests after, and talk about how the results there differ from what it tends to look like when you write the tests first, just to kind of convince you more that writing tests first is a good idea. So if we head to our following controller, we have this store method where we get the user to follow by looking up that user by their username in the database. We could have used that find by username thing here, but we didn't. Then we take the currently authenticated user, we follow the user to follow, and then we redirect back. So if we wanted to send a notification email, kind of the quickest, dirtiest way to kind of get that going, if we just wanted to just write the implementation, would be something like just using the mail facade and sending the mail here, right? So we might do something like mail send, and we got to pick a name for this template. So maybe it'd be like emails.newfollower. Send some data along, so maybe like who your new follower is. And that's going to be auth user, actually. And then you got to do this like closure to kind of configure the message, right? And we're going to need to probably use the user to follow. Font is a little big, so things are wrapping a little funny. Hopefully it's still legible. Actually, let's just get rid of the sidebar. Maybe that'll help. And then in here, you'd want to do something like mail or message to should be like user to follow email. And then the subject should be something like, if I could type, no? Something like, you have a new follower, something like that, right? So if we already had this code and we decided, okay, we want to go write tests for it after the fact, what would it look like to do? I think what people would naturally reach for is they would want to use like a mock, right? And a mock is a test double that lets you kind of set an expectation about what methods should be called. And I see this happen a lot when people are writing tests after the fact. They kind of look at their code and they see like, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this. So I'm going to make sure my test verifies that I do this, and I do this, and I do this. So what does that actually look like in a test? Well, you'd end up doing something like mail should receive, because you can actually like chain these kind of mock recalls directly off of facades in Laravel, which is kind of handy. I'll make sure we import that to mail facade here. So it should receive, what was the method called? Send. And now we have to specify what it should receive it with. So it should receive it with, we decided it was going to be emails.newfollower. And then some data, which was like, let's put this on separate lines so it's a little bit easier to follow. The data was going to be like a follower, which is the follower here. And then you have to do like, specify this closure somehow, like saying mail send should receive this closure as the third parameter. And people run into kind of problems here a lot in my experience because it's kind of really difficult to specify that you should receive this specific closure. And what I see people often do is kind of resort to something like mockery type closure, where they're just saying, as long as it gets like a closure as the last parameter, I'm going to say everything is fine. So if we run this test, let's see what happens. We get an error, mail not found, so make sure that we import the mail facade here. What's our next error? View emails.newfollower not found. So that's actually just happening because it's running this test first. We're mocking it out in this test, so I'm going to kind of shut this test off just so we get some more useful information. And it's green, right? So you might go ahead and think, cool, I've tested it, everything's good, I'm ready to move on to my next feature. But to me, this is like a super fragile test. Because what happens if like I sent it to the wrong person? Like what if I accidentally passed in, auth user? Or I guess we can just reach for that directly here, right? We can just do something like auth user email. And now if we run our tests, I don't know if an empty use statement works. They should all just die in a fire anyways. But. So our tests are still green, even though our code is wrong. Like we're sending a message to the wrong person. So I don't really have a lot of confidence in that test, right? So what can happen then is you can get down this super dark, grim path where you start doing something like, okay, well, how can I specify what should get passed here? One way to do that is to use this mockery helper called on, which is kind of difficult to explain, but the way it works is it takes a callback, and that callback takes the argument that was actually passed into that position, which in this case is a callback, And now in this on method, as long as we return true, mockery is going to consider that argument to be a valid match for what you were expecting. So if we did like return true here, for example, and just ran this test, it's always going to be green, no matter what I do in here, right? Like this stuff doesn't even have to be there. I can go back and run the tests, and it's green. It's fine. So in here, we can kind of do whatever is necessary to verify that that callback is the callback that we wanted. Well, how are you going to do that? There is a way that I will show you that will make you never, ever want to use mocks this way ever again for the rest of your life. So in trying to figure out how this is possible, this is what I ended up landing on. Basically, the callback that's getting passed here is this callback, right? And we need to pass a message into that callback and make sure that the message got the to method called with the right email and the subject called with the right subject. So we can create a new mock. So we can say mockery, mock, and then it's like message class, I think. Make sure we import that, illuminate mail message. And then we can say something like, well, the message should receive to with, and then it should receive it with someone's email, right? So we're going to have to like specify my email address here. So email is going to be adam@example.com. That domain cost me a lot of money. So it should receive to with adam@example.com. And it should receive that once. And then we have to make sure that we run the callback and pass the message in. And then we still have to return true no matter what, because we don't know that the callback was correct until mockery gets called in the teardown and verifies this mock. So if we run this test now, let's see what happens. Subject does not exist on the mock object. So we need to also mock the subject method and say that it should receive, you have a new follower once. Run the test and they're green. And now if we go back to the controller and we were to like pass in the wrong email here, right? Like, nope. Now the tests actually do fail because, mockery got called with the wrong thing. So you might think, okay, yeah, this is like solid. This is like proving that my code works. But it's like the ugliest shit I've ever seen in my life. And it's also like super fragile because you can chain these in actual implementation, right? And if I run this test again, it's going to break. And you know why it broke? Because our mock didn't return the message here. And if we run this again, now maybe it'll pass. But now if we decided that we wanted to flip these around, like maybe we called to before we called subject, put that arrow back in there, and run the tests again, now they're broken again. So you have these like super fragile tests that are super, super, super coupled to your implementation. You could also imagine like, what if I decided to like fire an event to like send an email instead of doing it this way? Well, now this test is like totally invalidated, like complete junk. So never ever do that. If you have code like that, delete it. So let's delete all this and talk about what it would look like to do this with test-driven development. Okay, so if we wanted to do this with TDD, instead of trying to like mock our exact implementation in our test, we would think about like, what is the outcome? What are we actually trying to test? Well, let's think, what are we actually trying to test here? Maybe we want to do something like this. We want to verify that the person received an email, make sure the followed user received an email. What else do we want to verify? Maybe make sure the email contains the name of the follower, and maybe make sure the subject, is you have a new follower, sort of thing. So when you're doing something in like a test-driven workflow, this is kind of like how I would define my expectations up front. I wouldn't be thinking, make sure the mail facade got called with send and this parameter and this parameter, and then a mockery on call that took a callback that created a message that was a mock that defined these, like, super gross. So how can we do this though, right? Like testing mail is kind of a difficult thing. Well, you can use a different type of test double. Instead of a mock, you can use what's called a fake. And a fake is like a real simple implementation you write of some interface or some other class, something that can kind of be swapped out for it, that mimics the behavior pretty closely, but kind of does things in memory in kind of a light sort of way, and often also exposes the ability to kind of use it for assertions and check things on it after the fact. So I don't have time to walk through building one from scratch, but I actually wrote a library for fake mail when I was working at Titan Co. called MailThief, which you can check out at titanco/MailThief on GitHub. And MailThief is like a fake mailer for Laravel that lets you kind of do this sort of thing. So the way that we would use MailThief here is the first thing that we would do is we would, in our setup method, tell MailThief to start intercepting all mail in the application. So the way that you do that is by calling MailThief hijack. And if we make sure we import this facade here, now any mail that gets sent is going to go to MailThief instead of trying to actually send it out to an SMTP server or anything. And MailThief just stores these messages that were sent in an array in memory and lets you look at it after the fact. So now to make sure that the user who is being followed received an email, well, what does that look like? It ends up looking something like this. This, assert true, MailThief has message for adam@example.com. And that's how you make sure that there was an email sent to that email address at some point in this test. Much cleaner, in my opinion, than the crazy mock stuff, right? Now, making sure that the email contains the name of the follower. Okay, so how can we do that? We could do something like this, assert true, MailThief, and now we can say last message, which gets us the last message that was sent to MailThief. And since we are planning to only send one message here, this is going to work perfectly fine. And then MailThief's message class is also a fake that lets us check things on the message. So we can verify that the message contains DHH. What a good day. Now making sure that the subject is you have a new follower. So we can just do something like this. This assert equals you have a new follower. MailThief, last message. Oh, subject. So we just get the subject of the last message and make sure it is what we expect it to be. So let's just run this test, because I probably made some mistakes somewhere. Failed asserting that false is true. So this is complaining that on line 44, MailThief does not have a message for adam@example.com. So using TDD, let's kind of drive this out one step at a time. So let's send a message to me. So we'll call mail send. We need to pass a template name here, so let's kind of use that programming by wishful thinking approach. So a new follower email, some data, but the tests haven't told us what data yet, so let's leave that empty. And then a callback that takes a message, and I guess we need to use the user to follow. And then send a message to that person's email. Run the tests, get some new error. There's no emails.newFollower view. So let's head over to our views folder here, and we'll create an emails folder where we can keep our emails. Call it newfollower.blade.php, and we'll just leave it empty and run the tests. Failed asserting that false is true on line 45. So what is the assertion there? Well, the message doesn't contain the text DHH. So that means that our first assertion passed. So we did successfully send a message to adam@example.com. So how can we make sure that it contains the name of the follower? Well, maybe we want to do something like follower username is now following you. Run the tests again. Undefined variable follower. Okay, so we need to make sure that we make the follower variable available in the template. So we do that by filling out this data array, right? So we can say the follower should be auth user. Run the tests again. Now we're failing to assert that the subject of the email is what we expected. You have a new follower. So now all we have to do is go back to our controller, and let's get rid of the sidebar again so it's easier to read. Message subject is you have a new follower. run the tests, and we're green. How much better is that than the test that we had before with the crazy mocks and stuff? To me, it's like so much more expressive in terms of like saying, okay, make sure that a message was sent to this person. Make sure that it contains this text. Make sure that the subject was set to what we expect versus that crazy mock setup. It's also like way more resilient to different types of changes. So for example, like, we had talked about chaining these before, right? If we just chain them, well, guess what? The tests still pass. We didn't have to change anything. Or if we call them in a different order or anything like that, it's all still gonna work because we're kind of using this kind of outcome style assertions about what we actually want to happen instead of just trying to mimic the code that we ended up writing in the controller in our test after the fact. Now, one other thing that you might want to do in situations like this, just kind of a little tip. I try to avoid making real specific assertions against text a lot of the time. You want to try and assert against the most stable thing possible. So this is the sort of text that maybe someone on the design team might decide to change for whatever reason, right? Like maybe they want to change it to you have a new follower on Twitter. Maybe they decide that that's a better subject. If they change that implementation, our test would fail, even though what we actually care about hasn't really changed in the system. You know what I mean? The behavior isn't different now. They just tweaked a little bit of copy. So a lot of the time I'll try and pick something that I think is real stable. So I might do something like assert contains new follower and make sure that the subject just contains the text new follower. So it passes right now, and if we were to go and say you have a new follower on Twitter with 2 exclamation marks because it's so awesome, it would still pass. But if somehow we sent an email I don't know, what's an email that Twitter might send you? Something like, you have a new DM or something, right? Our test is still gonna fail if we've actually somehow made a mistake and sent what is basically the wrong email. So I think that's kind of a useful thing to think about when you're writing tests like this, try and pick things to assert against that are as stable as possible. So, doing pretty good on time here, which is awesome because I have some more cool stuff to show. Looking at our implementation for this, a lot of people don't really like sending mail through the facade in the controller a lot of the time, right? Like I kind of alluded to before, kind of a common thing to do in these sorts of cases is dispatch an event and something's listening for that event and is gonna send an email based on that event being fired. So let's work on refactoring our implementation towards an event-based approach using test-driven development and just kind of see what happens. Sounds fun to me. So the way that I would do this is, since we kind of have this kind of super black box acceptance level test, this test is still gonna pass even if we switch to an event-based implementation, right? Because if the event gets fired and the listener is listening for it and the listener sends the email, well, at the end of the day, the mail is gonna be in the inbox, and that's all we're asserting against. So we have a lot of freedom here to refactor towards different implementations, and our test is not gonna become invalidated in any way. So we can still use this test to kind of guide us as we move towards an event kind of driven approach. So if we head back to the controller, let's just comment this out because we're gonna kind of need this code, and I don't wanna retype it again since we only got 25 minutes to go. And it could potentially take me more than 25 minutes to type 4 lines of code. Let's just kind of do this programming by wishful thinking thing again and see where we get. So you might do something like this, right? Event, fire, make sure we import that. And we want to fire a new follower event or something, right? And let's kind of think about what our parameters might be. Well, maybe it's going to be the person who's doing the following and the person who's being followed could be the parameters. So we'll pass in auth user and user to follow. And then we can just kind of go back to our tests and kind of let these tell us what we need to do next. So we get an error because there is no new follower class. So we can do something like artisan make event new follower, and then make sure to go back to the controller and import that event class. and run the tests. And now we get an error, failed asserting that false is true. So we're getting to that point where now we're in that kind of zone where our errors are very distant from the code that we need to write. And it might be useful to talk about driving out like a unit test, right? So the reason that it's failing is because our inbox doesn't actually have a message for adam@example.com. And we have to think about like, why does it not have a message for adam@example.com? Well, we fired the event, but like nothing's listening for the event or handling the event, right? So let's work on a class that's like an event listener that can do this mailing stuff for us and drive out that event listener with TDD. So in our unit folder, I'm going to create a new folder called listeners. I like to have my unit folder kind of mimic the app structure usually. It makes it easier to find things. And we'll create a new file. We'll call this listener something like email new follower notification test.php. And let's just copy our follow other users test for now, because it's going to have some similar sort of stuff going on. So this will be email new follower notification test. Let's kind of just delete anything that we know for sure we're not going to really need. And the test's name can kind of still be the same, or maybe test, it sends a notification email to the user being followed. Okay, so our setup can be similar. We'll have a follower and a followed. This act step is going to be a little bit different though, right? We're not going to like hit an endpoint anymore. We're going to just exercise this listener that doesn't exist yet. So let's create that listener. So we'll say the listener is going to be a new email, new follower notification listener. And then we want to do something like listener handle. And we're going to handle a new follower event, which is going to have the follower and the followed. And now aside from that, I think like what we're actually trying to verify at the end of the day is the same, right? We want to make sure that that person got that email. So let's just run this test and see what happens. No such table users. So we got to go back and make sure that we have our database migrations set up, right? Run the test again. Class email new follower notification not found. So let's generate that listener. So we can go artisan make listener email new follower notification listener. And then we have to specify the event that it's meant to accept on the command line, which in this case is a new follower event. If we head over to our listeners folder now, you can see that we have an email new follower notification class in place, just kind of scaffolded out for us. So this will get us past that point of the class not existing. No, maybe not, so we got to go and import it. Now that it exists, do we have the new follower imported as well? Might as well do that. Run this test again. Failed asserting that false is true. So we're kind of back to that same error where it's failing to assert that the message was sent. So how can we kind of like make that pass? So this is where I'm going to go and steal this code that we wrote in this controller and move that to our listener. So for now, let's just leave it exactly the same, even though we know it's totally wrong, and run the test and just see if we get some more useful errors. So there's no auth class in the lister's namespace. Well, we actually don't need to worry about authentication at this point, right? Because we explicitly have the follower and the following, which is kind of nice because we're working at this kind of more constrained unit level where we kind of specify the parameters and data with a little bit more precision. So rather than passing an auth user as the follower here, we actually want to get the follower off the event. So we can say the follower from the event, run the test again. Undefined property, there's no follower property on the new follower event. So we'll go to the new follower, we'll inject a follower, make it public so that we can access it. Run the tests again. Undefined variable user to follow, okay? So here we're trying to like use this user to follow thing, but it doesn't actually exist. Instead, we want to use the event and get the followed from the event. Run the tests again. Undefined property followed. So now the new follower event is missing the followed user. So again, we can inject that, make it public, run the tests, and now our tests are green. So that's pretty cool. Now, a lot of people are content to use like facades and stuff in the controller layer, but when you have like a constructor that's available here and you're in like a listener class, a lot of people feel like, well, I might as well just inject it, right? It's just as easy. So let's do a little bit of work to actually like inject the mailer instead of doing it this way. So we can head to our tests. Where we create it here, we can just pass in mail thief's instance. It's kind of like the singleton mail thief instance. Head back to our controller and kind of inject a mailer. And then down here, we can use this mailer send. And if we run these tests, hopefully we're still green, and we're still green. So now we've driven out this kind of event listener with TDD. And if you're not paying close enough attention, you might think, sweet, we're done, everything's good. But if we go back to our follow other users test and run it, we get an error. Why are we not passing this test? Well, this is kind of where the real value of acceptance tests start to like show themselves, in my opinion. And what's happened here is we've forgotten to wire up our event to our event listener. So even though all our unit tests are passing, our acceptance test that actually exercises the whole system and is making sure things are wired up is failing and telling us, hey, you should investigate this. And it's not always going to give you a clear error as to why, but at least it fails so that you don't deploy something that's broken to production. So if we head over to our event service provider, we can point the new follower events. Make sure we import that at the email new follower notification listener. And run our test again. Still getting an error. Unresolvable dependency mailer. Got it. Got to add a type hint. So if we type hint the mailer contract here, and run our tests, now we're green and everything's actually working. So that's pretty cool. Now, continuing. If we go and look at our follow other users acceptance test versus our email new follower notification test, they kind of are real similar, right? And you might make the argument that we have redundant coverage here in the sense that we have our listener that's kind of verifying that, like, yeah, when the listener gets called, it definitely sends the email and everything's kind of good. But also our acceptance test is trying to verify the exact same thing. And in a lot of cases, what you might choose to do, and which I think we should walk over and talk about, is instead of verifying that the mail got sent, especially now that you've kind of like used it as a black box test, got everything kind of working, a lot of time you might decide, okay, well, now I think all I want to verify is that the event gets fired, and let the event listener test worry about making sure that the event listener is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So Laravel supports the ability to kind of like make some assertions about events that got fired and stuff out of the box. And we can do that by doing something like this. So if we tweak this acceptance test, get rid of these assertions, at the top of the test we can do something instead like, actually it probably needs to be down here. No, I can actually go up there for now. So we can do like this, expects events. And this is gonna say, well, what event should be fired? And you can just do new follower class here. And if we run this, we get an error. These expected events were not fired. So we got to import that class probably. Yep. And now we're green, right? So you might think that this is enough. I don't. And the reason for that is this is not verifying enough to me. It's not verifying that we're necessarily firing the event correctly. And I'll show you an example of how this could be problematic. Imagine that in the controller here, you kind of made the mistake of getting these two parameters mixed up. So you passed like the user to follow as the first parameter and the follower as the second parameter. Well, this test passes because it did get that event fired. The listener test passes because when we test the listener, we've tested them in the right order, but the application doesn't actually work properly now. So I don't think this is quite enough in terms of verifying that like the event was sent the way we expected. So how can we go about doing it a little bit differently in a way that's a little bit more robust? So this is a situation where I think using a mock is like a reasonable thing to do. So we could do something like this. We could do something like event, and let's make sure we import that facade, should receive fire. And it should receive fire with a new follower event that takes the follower and the followed, right? And it should receive that once. And let's just run these tests and kind of see what happens. So we get an error complaining about mockery did not receive, there was no matching handler for the event that we actually fired. And this can be confusing at first, but the reason this is happening is because in our controller, we're like newing up a new follower event here. It's not like injected or anything, and we can't inject it. Like it doesn't make sense to inject it. And in the acceptance test, we're newing up a new follower event as well. And these are like, in like a shallow way, they're kind of the same, right? They're both the same class, they both took the same parameters, but one of them was newed up over here, and one of them was newed up over here. So when Mockery tries to compare them and make sure that like it was sent the right event, it's saying, no, you told me to expect this new follower event, and I received this new follower event instead. It's like an object ID, like in memory sort of clashing problem, right? So to get around this, we can use like that mockery on thing that I talked about before. So you can say like mockery on that takes an event, and then you could say something like return the event follower equals the follower, and the event followed equals the followed. And if we run this, hopefully we get some new insights. So undefined variable follower, so we gotta use the dreaded use statement. Run the test again. And now it's still complaining about not getting something that matches what was expected. And this is actually just a symptom of like the exact same problem that we were just talking about with the new followers events. In this case, like it's not the same followed class or instance, sorry. So you end up having to do something like this. Event follower ID equals follower ID, and event followed ID equals followed ID. And run the test again. And now check this out. Now we get an error that like this event was fired. Kernel.handled is an event that Laravel fired in the core, but we didn't have like anything programmed in Mockery to actually like listen for that event. So Mockery's like, hey, I received an event that I wasn't expecting. Your test is broken. So to get around that, you have to do something like this. Event should ignore missing, which basically says swallow any methods that get called on you that you're not programmed to be able to respond to properly. And if we run that, now it's green, okay? So we made progress. Now, one thing that I don't really like about using mocks, and this is not really specifically to like setting expectations per se, but about mocks specifically, is that when you're setting an expectation on a mock, you have to do it at this part of the test, right? I like to think of my tests like organized in a certain way. Traditionally, it's called like the arrange phase, the act phase, and then the assert phase, right? So you're kind of setting up the test, you're kind of doing whatever it is that you want to test, and then you want to make some assertions to make sure that what you expected to happen actually happened. In this case, we sort of have an arrange step. This is kind of like an arrange / assert step, and then we have like an act step. And I don't really like that I have some tests that are kind of organized one way and some tests that are organized another way. And this gets particularly gross if, say, like this is something that I actually do, like would do pretty often. In a case like this, I might now collapse this down into one test because it's not super specific about sending a notification email with a ton of assertions. Instead, it's just verifying that the event got fired. And because acceptance tests are most often a lot slower than unit tests, it's often beneficial to figure out ways to kind of reduce the amount of them that you have and somehow combine assertions in a lot of cases to kind of speed up your test suite to kind of make your workflow feel a little bit smoother. So if we had if we wanted to combine these, right, like maybe we use this arrange step, we use that act step, we copy this up here and set that up here. We're going to have to change this following thing, so we'll use this one. And then we can delete this test and make sure that this test is turned on again. Yeah, it's still turned on. Now if we run it, it's still green, so we kind of did everything right. But look how sort of unorganized and sloppy this test kind of feels now, right? Like we're doing some arrange, we're doing some mock programming, as well as telling the event to ignore certain things. We do some acting, and then we do some assertions. Now these are assertions, but they don't live with the other assertions. And I don't know, I don't really like that. So there's an alternative to using mocks, and it's a feature that Mockery supports. It's kind of a bit of a hidden feature that's not really documented, called spies. And now a spy does the same job as a mock in terms of letting you set an expectation and make sure that certain methods were called in certain ways. But a spy lets you do it at the end of a test instead of at the beginning of a test. So check this out. If we cut this and move this down here, and at the top of our test, in our kind of arrange phase, say something like event spy. So Laravel supports this as of 5.3 for sure. It might have got backported into 5.2 as well. So you can call the spy method directly on a facade. And instead of saying should receive fire with this stuff, we can say should have received fire. And if we run this test, if we didn't make any mistakes, everything is still green. And the other nice benefit of this is that because spies are always defined at the end, by default, they're programmed to ignore missing calls. So I don't even have to say this anymore. This can actually go away. And I can run this test, and everything is green. And if we were to go to our controller, and we made a mistake, and we weren't firing the event anymore, it's going to fail because fire was not called. So we know that everything's still kind of working the way that we expect it to work. And now we have a test that's kind of organized in kind of a more consistent way. And has a little bit less stuff that you have to specify. And we've kind of removed some of that test duplication. One other thing that I would like to talk about quickly that I meant to talk about earlier, but it's a long talk with lots of stuff, so it's kind of hard to remember everything, is that here in our event or our email new follower notification test, we're creating these users and sticking them in the database, right? And if we look at how long this test takes, it's 113 milliseconds, 117 milliseconds. But we actually don't need these users to be stored in the database for this test, because all we're doing is reading the username, and the email, and making sure that we fire an email. We're not actually saving anything. We're not actually fetching relationships or anything like that. So in this case, we can actually switch create to make. Now, if we run the test right now, it's not going to really be considerably different. But now we can remove this database migration stuff. And this test can run without a database. And now it's running at 78 milliseconds, 70 milliseconds, 64 milliseconds. So you can imagine if you can make these sorts of little tweaks in lots of different places in your application, that it's going to add up pretty quickly over time and speed up your test suite. Now, there's a cost to it in the sense that you're coupled to the fact that this can't depend on the database now, and if the implementation changes in a way that does depend on the database, well then all of a sudden the test is going to break. But it's just a trade-off that sometimes you have to make for test speed and stuff like that. So anyways, 10:23, supposed to be done at 10:30, managed to get through, I think, everything that I wanted to show you people. And so that's kind of my test-driven development workflow in Laravel. That's kind of how I build stuff out. Hopefully you learned something about kind of a good way to kind of do this stuff. And took some stuff away from kind of the decision-making process that goes into deciding when I should create a unit test, when I should use the database, when I shouldn't, when I should use a mock, when I should not use a mock, how to use a spy, how to use a fake instead of a mock, stuff like that. We talked about a lot of different stuff here, so hopefully everyone was able to pick up a couple new things and learn some new things. And if you have any questions or you want to talk about this stuff more, I'll be around. Come find me. I don't think we have a ton of time for questions here, but just come find me and we can talk about it. And that's all I got for you. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Now, one other thing, actually, I said I had something to announce here. And that is that I'm actually working on a new project, test-driven Laravel, like a full video course, where I'm going to be building an entire application with TDD and screencasting the whole thing and recording it. You can sign up and to learn more about it at testdrivenlaravel.com, and I'm hoping to release it this fall. So if you enjoyed this and learned some stuff, check that out and subscribe, and I'll keep you updated and let you know when it's ready. And yeah, thanks everyone. I'm Adam Wathen. Check out my podcast. Hope you learned something.